not everybody, in fact, many people aren't numbers driven, in where sort of our classic machine learning techniques are obviously mostly based around numbers and structured data in a way that like people need more education to understand it. I personally have been coding on and off for close to 30 years, right? Like since I was in high school, I've learned to code in at least a dozen languages over the course of my career.
Starting off small actually also helps get your organization and the rest of the employees on board with what you're trying to do.
The use of data, interacting with AI tools and models and all of that without having to learn to code first. I think that opens up so much potential for people to really take what they know.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to BetterTech, where we explore the forefront of technological innovation. I'm your host, Sophia Moshasha, and I'm thrilled to guide you through the exciting realms of emerging technologies. With a career dedicated to advancing XR and leveraging its potential across diverse sectors, I bring a wealth of knowledge and unique insights into how these technologies are transforming our world. And here at BetterTech, we're on a mission to connect you with the visionaries and trailblazers of the tech industry, diving deep into the trends and innovations that are setting the course for our future. And I want to welcome our guest, Conor Jensen, who is the Global Field CDO at Dataiku. Welcome, Conor.
Thanks, Sophia. Excited to be here.
So, Conor, to start off, could you share with us a bit about your journey into getting into the sector and how your experiences have shaped your views on the strategic use of AI and data in business?
Yeah. So as anybody who's sort of been doing, I guess, what we now typically refer to as data science or AI, it's not where I initially started. I've been working in and around data and analytics, both from the sort of like development per side, as well as the usage side, sort of for now the last 20, 25 years. I'd say this journey like primarily started for me as a meteorologist in the Air Force. And that was so early 2000s. And there, my job as a weather forecaster was to sort of use models and data to come up with forecasts as run up, right? So highly specialized domain, lots of data, lots of advanced modeling techniques that we were using then. And when I got out of the Air Force, I went back to school and then studied math. And so my degree was in math. I then sort of finished up, and while I was actually in school, I was working at Starbucks and managing there. And so then it was sort of the other end of the spectrum of like out in the field making decisions with whatever you had at hand, and usually not enough, right? And so like basic stuff, so, I write my like algorithms for doing like our inventory management and like ordering or like where scheduling and things like that to sort of make my own life easier because I'm a math nerd, and so that it sort of helped me there. But it was I wasn't none of this was with like big math or big data or anything like that. It was sort of like, here I'm gonna like back in the unload quick and easy sort of stuff, but it made my life as a manager much, much easier. And I should know, ridiculously profitable. Like my store ran like a 31% margin, right? So like we had like, we made more money than any other store in our district, even though we weren't like one of the busiest stores, right? So like I sort of then had sat on one side of the spectrum of using vast amounts of data, super complicated models, and then but sort of like handing off that information to others to make the decisions, right? Like we were ops support when I was in the Air Force. Then being in the field where sort of not enough data, not enough information, but just sort of like using what I could to make my life a lot easier. Then, about say 15 years ago, after I'd gotten out of the military, I went into sort of the corporate sector. And after I finished my degree, I was in the corporate sector. I actually went into insurance. And there, I was really, really lucky to be working in a company that now about like 12, 13 years ago decided to invest in data science, right? And this was sort of like when big data was the flavor of the day. And I just was sort of luckily positioned to have the experience, both from sort of like knowing the financial side of being in insurance. I've been working in the actuarial field, and then sort of like the practical side of like having been in the business and having owned a P&L and sort of been on the front lines. And so I ended up at a company, I ended up in that company helping over 3 years to build out our data science team, our department, our function, and then the technology. And that's sort of where I have ended up now spending really over the last decade is, focus on the architectural and data side to figure out how do we sort of help big companies be successful with using their data and this technology to do it. And so, I sort of have worked my way from huge companies, right? The Air Force obviously went vast into, now I'm in the startup and in the vendor space. But really, my focus is working with companies like my former employers to actually try to make sense of what they have and be successful with the technology. So it's been a weird journey and mostly just happenstance, but it's been fun.
It's so interesting that your vast experience in a variety of fields, like in the trenches, dealing with a bunch of data, has kind of driven you to this conclusion of we can do better, and which kind of started you on your track towards, big data and AI and making smart decisions based on these smart complex algorithms. Um, and that only came from you kind of being in the trenches and kind of seeing the issues that we have and the inconsistencies, and lots of time just a big mess that a lot of
Sure.
people, a lot of companies are kind of stuck kind of deciphering and going through, and a lot of times it's too late by the time they're able to make sense of the data. So what you're doing is really helping, from the consumer level, small companies
Try.
to the large companies, really make sense of it all.
Yeah. And that's, I think, what helps from a relevance perspective of, my experience really does that sort of, hey, I've been in multiple domains. I worked in finance and insurance, I worked in retail, I worked in the military and meteorology. And it's like, sort of have seen that. So when I'm talking to, a customer, it doesn't really matter what sector they're in, right? I understand, I may not know like the very specific sort of like nuances of being in manufacturing or in whatever, but like, the broad principles are pretty applicable everywhere. And so that's definitely where
Mhm.
we're trying. And that's how we approach it from a platform perspective as well. So.
Yeah. So you've obviously been at the forefront of helping companies integrate AI and data-driven decision making into their strategies. What are the common challenges businesses face when starting on this path, and how can they start to overcome them?
Yeah. So the handful of sort of like the most typical challenges we see, one is an overly complex infrastructure, right? Like, and this is one that is hard, almost impossible to get right. And like the perfect architecture doesn't exist. So it's not like there is this beautiful, I mean, everyone loves the blank sheet of paper when you're saying like, this is our idealized architecture. But then you turn around and you're like, well, we're 50 years old, 100 years old, 200 years old. We've done M&A, we've got acquisitions, we've got 20 different systems and all to do the same thing. Just talking to somebody a week or two ago who was like, yeah, we have 53 ERPs. So, right? Like, it's like, it like hurts, it viscerally hurts. But that, like, simplifying your architecture is a never ending journey because it's so easy to go more complicated, just another software, another system, another acquisition, whatever. And so, like, too complex is just a killer for people because it just makes it so hard to move forward. So that's a
Mhm.
reason that I mean it's that and it's obviously, especially in enterprise, you see that very commonly, right? Especially because of how often people have M&A and all of that sort of stuff. But honestly, even in a company that's mid-size or even a smaller company and has never acquired things like that, like even there you tend to get too complicated very quickly, right? And so like being very very strategic around how do you rationalize tools, how do you simplify, how do you have the fewest number of tools that serve the most number of people should always be the aim of that sort of that IT organization. And I think people don't always look at it that way. So that's the first one. The second one, we hear people talk about this a lot, of sort of like the skills gap of what sort of skills do you need to do to do AI and data science and all of this. And there's a focus on going out and hiring then and bringing people in, whether it's from tech or from your competitors or whatever that are farther along that have known that. But there's also the skills gap of the people that you have learning how to work with data and make smarter decisions, right? And so there's examples that I gave of when I was a store manager working at Starbucks, right? Like I wasn't a data scientist. I was still in school studying math. It wasn't, but I was able to work with basic models of basic data to sort of make my own life easier. And, that it's obviously my own natural inclination, but every one of my peers could easily have done the things that I did if somebody brought it to them, right? And we're not necessarily meeting people where they are. And I think sometimes we sort of focus, then we're like, oh, well, then we should make citizen data scientists. And so everybody should go learn SQL and Python or R or whatever, which is to me always the wrong way to look at it. It's more sort of like, what data do they need? What decisions are we making? How is it the decisions they're making? And sort of bring them tools that meet them where they are. So there's sort of this two-way street, and we need to bring talent in that can do. I think sometimes we try to bring talent in that's too far down the road. So like talent that's at maybe like the next step or knows the next step of where we want to go, but then also figuring out how to upskill and enable the rest of our people to use data and models more intelligently. So that's the second one, that skills gap. And then the third that I, definitely feel both from, when I was on the other side of the fence and as I'm working with Festories and prospects here, is really it's a very long-term game. And the incentives that C-suites and board of directors, and especially if you're a publicly traded company, like the incentive for sort of investing in something that is going to be I mean, at a minimum, a multiple years journey to be able to move from where you are today to having the infrastructure, the people, all of that. Like, it's not a quarter by quarter sort of return process. And yes, we sometimes on the data side can take too long to get to the point. And if 2 years have gone by and you don't have anything to show for it, that's also a failure of the data team. But like, there's a weird mismatch of sort of how we incentivize people to think about investing in building these capabilities and the patience and understanding of C-suites and boards, especially, that then like can be at odds with what it really takes to make these changes, which are hugely cultural changes, right? Which everybody knows, like you can't change culture in a quarter or a year, right? I mean, that's like a decade's long journey. So I'd say those are the biggest stumbling blocks that we see time and time again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see it in my industry as well, in terms of like, it can seem overwhelming and daunting to do a whole overhaul of architecture and infrastructure and business operations. But really you have to think of it in these small wins, and it's actually better for the company as well, because to be able to be agile and do quick turns and analysis of how the processes are working, and being able to kind of revise based off of that. So it's a good thing that you're helping companies kind of think that way, because they do need to move towards these smart data driven decision making processes. And starting small is often the way to build long-term success as well.
I think one thing that is a trap, so that sometimes comes there, is you also need to start small and deliver quickly, right? But it can't be at the expense of an investment in what is the long term, right? Because I sort of see people sometimes go to one extreme or the other of, every week, every month, all right, what are we solving today? What are we solving tomorrow? What are we solving next week? And like, that's important, right? Because then you're going back to business and saying like, hey, here's what we've accomplished and here's the, the tangible benefits. Let's be honest, when a, team gets a new CSV, and you're like, no, the math behind the CSV is better than it used to be. They're sort of like, okay, whatever, right? Like, I guess we believe you that this has changed, but right, it's a new lead score, it's whatever. Like, you're making incremental changes, but it doesn't wow people, right? And the other end of the spectrum is sometimes it's like, oh, well, we're going to do this like gigantic, hairy, audacious, this massive project or whatever, and you'll see it in 3 years, right? And like, that gets people excited with the vision, but it's also something that takes replatforming and new technologies and people to be trained. And so like, you have to, it's not either or that, right? You have to be doing both of these things, and you have to give people like a really compelling, this is where we're going, and some of the amazing, use cases or things that we're going to build and enable, but that will take time. And you need to give people that like vision that they are like, yes, I see that this is cool and we're moving towards something. But then in the meantime, you need to be delivering so that it's not just people are waiting 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and it's still, well, it's coming. And so like, it's not either or. You have to do both of these things. And I think I tend to see people go to one side or the other.
Yeah, and starting off small actually also helps get your organization and the rest of the employees on board with what you're trying to do, because it's not just so like visionary. It's like things that they can see that are being implemented and deployed in real time, that they can actually kind of understand and kind of get behind and
Absolutely,
go with that mission.
and including them in the process, right? Like letting them help you decide what to work on. So yeah, totally.
Yeah, absolutely. You have to sell that vision in.
Yes. Every day.
So yeah, right. So can you give us maybe an example of a transformative impact that adopting a data-driven culture has had with either one of your client organizations or an organization that you've just seen adopt these types of practices?
I'll give a couple examples that I thought were really cool recently that we've seen with customers. One was a retail customer who's done, like, they've been a customer of ours for a while, and I'd say they're making really good strides, right? So they were already like well poised, and when the craze of, now almost 18 months ago, and the craze of Gen AI hit, right? They were far enough along in their journey that they were able to have sort of pretty real conversations around like, what is Gen AI and should we be using it? And, even there's still some of that like top-down pressure suddenly from the board and the CEO in a way that, wasn't there before, but I would say it enhanced it. They already had like a regular touch point, even like the head of the data and AI team already had a regular touch point with the C-suite and the board. And so, but it intensified, right? And so they were able to really embrace some of the technology. And one of the use cases that they have already deployed and they're already using is in writing draft copy for their website, right? So it's a retailer, they have product descriptions that they're out there. And we were in an internal event they did recently where the head of the marketing team that writes all the copy for the website was like, this is amazing because my team is able to use this. We've fed it all this, historical data. We can say, hey, here's the picture of it. Here's here's the tags for this. It's a sweater. It says that, whatever. But, for the marketing people, and I love this, was, like, how hard is it to write the 15th description of a sweater in a row, right? Where it's just like that first draft is really, really hard. And you're like, I need a new acronym or a new synonym for soft, right? Like, but really, getting the first draft from the Gen AI tools was actually help them go a lot quicker and have a better result at the end with sort of, less, I don't want to say less effort, but sort of like, like more pointed effort, I guess, for putting their efforts into the parts of like really making it feel like the voice of the company and everything like that. And it was just cool to me that it was, I think that they estimated like a 30% time savings, right? Over the course of, what they had been doing before moving into this. And while it's not like the most, that particular use case isn't itself like, transformative of the company. The thing that was cool to me was that, this is one of many use cases that they were doing that, in the span of the last, 12 months with, the advent of some of the generative AI tools, they were ready. They had the platforms there, they had the data there, and they had the culture there that, when the data science team said, hey, I think we can do this, the marketing team said, cool, right? This is great. And they're more excited about the use case than the data scientists were, even though, of course, the data scientists are excited to be building, with the latest and greatest Gen AI tools. And so that one, I think, was a really cool example. And another example of someone who's sort of earlier in the journey, but still, I think, really exciting and compelling is a customer of ours that is like a manufacturing company. And they make plastics, and it's a very old school company, very old school organization. They have a leader there who's been there for maybe about 2 years now, sort of leading their data initiatives, and has been, it's a lot of work. It's taking a company that is not historically like very innovative company in terms of like what they do from a manufacturing perspective, but the thought of like systems and data and all that sort of stuff has never been in their wheelhouse. And they did an on-site recently at one of their plants, where, they had a lot of sort of resistance, especially from the field of, and I mean, we've seen this borne out in surveys is, companies are less trusted by their employees when they're out there saying we're using AI, right? Because I think if there's just all this, there's and genuinely reasonable sort of like uncertainty about the impacts of AI on jobs and everything like that. And so they sort of have some of this resistance, especially from an old school company where it's like, most of the people are in a plant, literally like working on machines. What does AI have to do with us? And they went in there, and I think they were talking, the first couple of days, nobody wanted to talk to them, right? Like it was, what are you guys doing here? You're here to mess with us, or you're here to do whatever. But they were working with one of the production lines, and were pretty quickly easy to show how sort of using data, they could predict whether or not a machine was like in calibration. In like, normally they would have to run the machine for like an hour, and then they would test it. And then they go, oh, it's out of calibration. Let's tweak it, run it for another hour. And so it could take them literally like a whole day to get it calibrated to do something new. Then they're able to like identify within like 5 minutes, right? And so it saved this team huge amounts of like time, energy, and materials that was just being wasted and everything. And again, it's that use case in and of itself, great. They saved some money on that line. That's awesome. But by the time they left the plant at the end of that week, the rest of the supervisors were asking, like, when are you guys coming back? And like, when are you going to work with us? Right. And so it's, we see it as one of the cool things about Dataiku in the space that we work in is that, we see some of the companies that really are out at the front edge and that are finding applications of generative AI and like all the new things, and they're poised and they're ready and they're able to do it. But then also the other end of the spectrum where companies who are very like greenfield in terms of how they're using data and AI, but have enormous possibilities. And to see the excitement that you can see from some of those, like that I like to see that. Sometimes that's actually more fun to see, to be super honest, right? Where it's like the application may be from a, especially if you're in the tech space, it may seem really rudimentary, but then you're like, oh no, like this is like real people, real impacts, real differences. Like that's always really, really exciting and compelling.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely interesting to see more of these traditional, I guess, physical labor companies
Yeah.
all turn, they all turn to some kind of data-driven operations. So eventually, everybody's going to be needed to be primed on some of these skill sets as well. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I always thought that these technologies were going to be a tool for humanity, not necessarily replace them, but enable them to actually do more, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And that,
Um,
the example that I often sort of think of that as as companies are thinking about how to change they do is, I go back to when I was working in meteorology, was the guys that taught me how to forecast, who had, grown up in the 70s and 80s as forecasters, did it with far less data and far less models. And, like satellite technology was different and everything. And so it was a much more manual process 40 years ago. And so the guys who were teaching us how to do it had grown up with that, but were like, when they'd show you models and this sort of stuff, like you needed to know the fundamentals, but they were thrilled and excited to have this better data, these better
mhm.
models and all that sort of stuff. And so it's like, it was still being a meteorologist, right? If you're a meteorologist 40 years ago or 20 years ago or today, it's the same job, right? It's not like they're all now data scientists. They didn't change careers or anything like that, but the accuracy by which they can work, the speed at which you can work, and like that is really exciting and compelling to sort of see how a career field can change over the course of, and it's a long game, but it's really compelling to sort of see that. And that's what I'm excited about, like looking at the stuff that's happening in plants or this, whatever it is, right? In retail and manufacturing or whatever, like what is it going to look like to be working in a production line in 20 years, or to be working as a marketer in 20 years, or whatever, right? Like there's so much potential from the technology to help us do the really interesting parts of the job and to be better at what we're doing today, not to just like be automated
Yeah.
away, because I don't think the AI is that good yet. Let's be fair.
No, I mean the human factor is always going to be important in one way or another, and that's an important message to get across.
Yes, absolutely.
So you've alluded that the balance between technical and business teams and utilizing data effectively is often delicate. How do you recommend organizations bridge the gap between these teams so they can
Hmm.
harness the full potential of their data?
So I think a big part of it comes down to like, how are you deciding what to work on and who are you including in that process, right? I think that it's very easy to sort of go out to the business from the IT and the dev side, go out to the business, say, hey, what are your problems? What do you guys want to work on? You get a list of things to work on, and then you go away and then you're just off doing, right? Or you sort of sit with the executives and you say, hey, what would you guys like us to work on? And they say, I want you to do A, B, and C. And you go do A, B, and C. And the people who are going to be using whatever you created, the people who are going to be most impacted, or to be honest, the people who are in the trenches on that day-to-day basis and actually know what's working and what's not and everything like that. That to me is where that sort of key is. And when you go to the trenches, you go to the actual desk workers, you go to the people who are on a production line in the plant, like they can identify for you what works and what doesn't. And
Mhm.
not everybody is going to be really, really willing and interested, and not necessarily everybody's going to have enough, even sort of the baseline knowledge to really understand. Sometimes people are super excited, they're like, we can do this. And I'm like, oh, yes. And if I could, I would be a billionaire. So that's a really cool idea, but it's, we can't actually do that. At least not today. But you'll find the people who are excited. You will find the people who are interested, who want to learn, who want to work with you. They'll give you good ideas. And then as you bring them along with that sort of development experience, and this is where I think there's the data product world, right? So AI, data science, machine learning, et cetera, has a lot to learn from sort of other aspects of product and world, is that we fall down at the user experience a lot, to be really honest, right? And it's one of the things that I've focused on more and more over the last maybe sort of like 5 years or so, as I've sort of realized that more and more, is that how somebody interacts with the output of a data product is still tricky and still not something we're really great at. And we need to refine a lot there. When we think about, give like a discrete example, we think about giving, to an underwriter at, a bank for a mortgage, or an underwriter at an insurance company. You just say, hey, here's the price that we think that this risk should be priced at. And maybe you have two different risks and they both come out to say $10,000, right? You're insuring a building for a year. Yeah. And it says $10,000. But, maybe on one, the confidence interval, the number that comes in is we think that the answer is between $9,000 and $11,000. And so you go, okay, like I feel pretty good about $10,000. And the other one also says $10,000, but the confidence interval, the statistic says it's between 4 and 20,000, right? So it's like, it's way more volatile and whatever. We don't have as good a data or anything like that. And so, if we present just $10,000 in these two different situations, they both look the same to that person who's interacting with the model. Versus if you present it with, here's the median or the mean that we think we're going to predict, and then here's something to give you a sense for sort of how certain we are of that prediction, then that person is equipped to sort of go, oh, this one, good at $10,000. This one, I need to go spend more time at this and actually apply some of my own reasoning to it. Or maybe it seems too volatile. I actually don't want to insure that customer or something like that. And it's little things that we can think about in terms of how we're presenting the output of a model, output of data, et cetera. We hear there's a lot of, there's a lot of questions or around like the hallucinations of Gen AI, right? Of, well, how do I trust what's coming on the model? Well, you should, to an extent, just as much as you trust the person who sits in the cubicle next to you, right? Like if you ask them a question, which subjects they're good at and which subjects they're not good at. And then when they say something, you know how to go validate that answer, and it's that sort of stuff. And so it's like, but we can think about how do we present the information coming out of, a generative AI model. If you asked it a question and it gives you an answer, we could actually look at, depending on the probability that word is the next word in the sentence, like shade it differently, right? Like, we can actually, so we need to think there's a lot more, and I am not a UI UX specialist, right? So like, but there are people who are user experience. They are interfaces specialists. And I think that this is an area that is lacking in the sort of data product and AI world, that is a huge room for opportunity and improvement, because I think it will change how people interact with the models if we think differently about how we present that information.
Yeah, that's really interesting you say that. I was recently sitting in a panel with government executives and talking about AI, and they were talking about how the first step in that is data validation, because they have a lot of data coming in and out, and understanding what is going to feed them the best results, or even how to interact with that data and those algorithms to feed them the results that they're looking for. Lots of like anomalies and things like that that need to be sifted. And that's another part of what I believe the human factor is actually good for as well, right?
Yeah, because they know the domain, right? Like they know
right,
which parts are tricky and which are not. And it's sort of like they need to take that perspective to sort of say, and this is where I think the onus is, there's some onus on the users, right? To sort of say like, okay, like the computer spit out an answer. How do I go and make sure that that's the actual right answer? Do I need to Google it? Do I need to do whatever? Hell, half the time if you get an answer from ChatGPT and then you ask ChatGPT, is that answer correct or not? It's usually right that second time. If you're like, is this a good answer? And it'll be, no, it actually seems like that this case cited by the thing doesn't seem to exist or whatever. So it's like, and sometimes it doesn't take that much effort, but we do have to change how people are thinking about and validating that information in the same way that like I would validate before I went to my boss with an answer what you told me. when I was like, hey, what do you think? And you're like, you say this, I'm like, oh, maybe that sounds right. How do I go validate that before I go off to the boss and say, this is the
Yeah.
answer?
Yeah, you hit on it. You have to know. You have to be know the subject matter.
Yes.
Know enough
Yes.
about it to know what a good answer might look like, and
Absolutely.
what more digging you might have to do in those types of things. And it's just gonna make you smarter as a person as well. So looking forward, what emerging trends or technologies in AI do you believe will have the most significant impact on business decision making? What are you looking forward to?
I mean, we can't escape generative AI and sort of what's happening there, right? I think that there is a lot because there's so much data that we deal with that is that sort of unstructured data, right? Text
Mm,
or otherwise, that is like just difficult and time consuming for people to get to. And the acceleration you can get using some of the generative AI tools, even the simpler applications, is really like retrieval augmented generation and just like that ability to sort of query your own documents. I think that that's a huge one, but I think that not just from the application of the tools itself, but in some of what we've been talking about, like, will this help people understand how to work with these tools better?
mm,
Because words and understanding and like, here's the, recommendation of which document I should go look at to answer this question or something like that, will teach people, hey, the models aren't always right. And here's how I can think about working with it in a way that like not everybody, in fact, many people aren't numbers driven in where sort of our classic machine learning techniques are obviously mostly based around numbers and structured data in a way that like people need more education to understand it. And so that's why I'm really excited about some of the aspect of generative AI, just like by exposing it to more people and getting people who would get scared away from the sort of the mathy side of things. But they can really sort of gain, it's a better entry point for a lot of people. And so
mm,
that's one. The second one, and I think that this is long been an area that like I've been really excited about, and I think it's closer and closer to sort of reality, is that the barrier to entry for working with, machine learning and AI tools for so long was the need to code because of the types of systems that people could access to get into them. Whether you're talking long enough ago that you're working with things like SPSS and SAS, SAS, obviously, or, in the last now sort of 20 years or so, where it's shifted primarily to using SQL and R and Python and stuff, because this was stuff that was on servers to have capacity for the data and everything like that, if you wanted to work with larger volumes of data, numbers, text, whatever, you had to go and learn how to code first. And I personally have been coding on and off for close to 30 years, right? Like since I was in high school, I've learned to code in at least a dozen languages over the course of my career, and I've hated all of them, and I've sucked equally at all of them. Like I am not a software engineer. I failed CS 101 twice the first time I left campus in college. Like it is, and I can hack my way to a solution when I have to, but it's not enjoyable to me. And if I'm no code I've ever written should ever touch a production system, right? I've known that for a long time, and I don't have any qualms with that. But so the advent of tools that are making it easier to interact with data without the barrier of having to learn to code first, I think is great, not just for, not just for me personally, but for so many people who they don't, they know their domain. They've spent a lot of time and energy learning, a subject. They've learned the domain. They know the customers. They know whatever. You don't want to learn to code, fine, but you can still now use tools to access. And, obviously generative AI is even a big piece of that. We've tested internally actually like building full-blown like feature engineering pipelines, with multiple sources of data and training a model and everything. Like, is that what the Gen AI tool, writes for me the first, what am I going to put into production? No, that shouldn't go to production any more than my code should go to production. But it gives you that first draft, right? And if you get 80% of the way there to having a data pipeline built in, an hour from a tool versus 3 days or 3 weeks or however long it takes you to get there, like that's amazing. And if it's for my own decision making, that may even be good enough. But then it's also a starting point for me to go work with the data science team or the data engineering team to go take it the next step further and all of that. And so that the closer and closer we get to sort of people being interact with large quantities of data, interacting with AI tools and models and all of that without having to learn to code first, I think that opens up so much potential for people to really take what they know, be better at what they're doing, um, without, having to then go like, oh, well, go get a master's in data science and then come back to me and you can work with this data. So that's the part that I'm most personally excited about. And I think, we've been talking about things like, sort of like the, query-based interactions, or semantic search and all that sort of stuff for a long time. And the technology has just never quite been there, right? Or it's been sort of inching its way there. And I think over the last couple of years, that's really taken some huge leaps forward. So that's the area that I think I'm probably most excited about, and where I think that especially from a business perspective, right? So we're not talking about what's exciting for the 1% of the 1% that are like doing R&D on these, like that's a whole different topic. But for the masses and for what's going to really make a difference in the business, whatever makes it easier for the 90% of their employees to work with their data and stuff, that's where I see it.
Yeah, absolutely. And like we said before, it drives even more of that trust and understanding on what these tools can actually do. So then they maybe make more, drives them to make more of an investment in kind of building out these tools for wide scale for the organization as well.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely.
So what last bits of advice would you give listeners who are leaders in their organizations that are looking to foster this culture of data-driven decision making? And more importantly, how can they measure success along the way to better enable their organization and better inform their organization that, these new tools and processes are actually working?
I think the first piece to me is, and it's, very much a sort of techie thing of sort of like eating your own dog food, right? Like as a leader, are you getting your hands dirty with the data, right? Are you in there using the tools you're asking your team to use? That's to me, first and foremost. And then how are you asking questions of it, right? And regardless of what function you're in, what sort of an example are you setting? And when you get in a one-on-one with your team, right, or a team meeting or a one-on-one with someone on your team or whatever, like, are you asking them questions that make it seem like this is actually a priority to you, right? Like, what are you working on this week? Oh, like, how did you decide that those were the accounts that, and I've asked sales leaders this, they're like, oh, well, we're really data-driven. I'm like, oh, well, when you're hiring a brand new salesperson, you ask them how they work with data and like what that does for them. I've still yet to have a sales leader say yes. Obviously, Brent's right. No, that's not how you sell. And I'm like, well, okay, but then it's just words. It's just lip service, right? And so regardless of which function you're in, are you in finance? Are you in marketing? Are you in sales? Are you in IT? Are you in whatever, right? Like, what are you doing? But then, like, when you talk to your teammates, when you talk to your team members, when you talk to your peers, do you sort of like validate, hey, we rolled out a new tool for you guys last month. How's it going, right? Do you trust the results you're getting out of the model? If not, like, why not, right? Or what data do you wish that you had? Like, are you asking them questions that like actually shows that you're invested in and that you're seeking to understand, right? And, I worked with, some leaders who sort of really like the data and use it a lot themselves. And then it sort of feels like information asymmetry sometimes. It's like you come into a meeting and they're like, oh, well, I was looking at this report and I see that your performance, da-da-da-da-da. And I'm like, okay, I don't, what report? I don't have that report. I can't see that report. What data goes into that report? How did you make this? And so it's like, sometimes we segregate data and make more data accessible to leaders than we do to the field. And I'm like, and maybe it is, I guess enough years of data science, like, oh, it's sort of, it's like anathema to me. I'm like, no, not everybody should have access to all the data, but like more is better, right? But like more with control and security and auditability, but also education. Here's how to use that data. Here's how to think. So like that, maybe a long-winded way to sort of like use the data yourself and ask your team how they're making decisions with data on a regular basis. At the end of the day, that's how to drive the change, right? That's how you get there.
Yeah, so that sounds like a simple enough recipe for me.
So simple, not easy, I guess I would say, right?
Right. Well, thank you, Conor, so much for your insightfulness on all of this. It's very timely, and if you are not already using some kind of data-driven decision making, generative AI, any of these tools, I'm sure we both encourage everyone to go and do that. Yes. And just start playing with them, no matter what field you're in. It doesn't matter. It's going to touch you either in your personal life or your professional life.
Yes. The
Yeah.
change is coming, right? And like you can embrace it and be a part of it or not, but like
Or miss the train. Yeah.
or you can miss the train. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Connor.
Thanks, Sophia. I appreciate it.